In Soviet military planning during the Cold War, the concept of sustained high-intensity operations in the Western theater of military operations, known as the Western TVD, rested on a logistical framework designed to support approximately 30 days of continuous combat at the front level, a planning assumption embedded in doctrinal manuals, operational art instruction, and large-scale exercises conducted across the Warsaw Pact. The Western TVD encompassed the strategic axis directed toward Central Europe, including East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, where Soviet and Allied formations were positioned to conduct offensive operations against NATO forces in the event of war. Within this framework, logistics was not treated as a secondary support function, but as an integrated component of operational design, structured around the concept of echelon supply, pre-positioned stockpiles, and structured rear services, known in Soviet terminology as Tyel. The 30-day model did not imply that war would end in a month, but that front-level formations were expected to maintain high-tempo offensive operations for a defined initial campaign period before major resupply from deeper strategic reserves would be required. This assumption shaped stockpile depth, transportation planning, fuel allocation, and ammunition production schedules across the Western TVD. Soviet doctrine divided sustainment responsibilities into layered echelons, with Army-level and front-level rear services managing ammunition dumps, fuel depots, repair facilities, medical evacuation routes, and transportation assets in close coordination with operational commanders. Rail networks played a central role in this system, as the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies relied heavily on rail mobilization to move fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements from interior military districts toward forward assembly areas. Railway troops were assigned to maintain, repair, and expand lines under combat conditions, reflecting the expectation that transport corridors would be contested. Fuel planning was particularly detailed, with consumption rates calculated for armored and mechanized units under offensive conditions, and pipeline networks were extended toward likely axes of advance to reduce reliance on vulnerable tanker convoys. Ammunition stockpiles were dispersed in depth, with forward dumps supporting immediate operations, while larger reserves were maintained farther to the rear to sustain subsequent phases. Repair and recovery doctrine assumed high attrition rates, and mobile repair brigades were structured to restore damaged equipment rapidly, preventing degradation of combat strength during the 30-day period. Soviet military publications emphasized the importance of tempo, recognizing that offensive momentum required uninterrupted supply flow, and thus logistics planning was synchronized with operational timetables that specified daily advance rates and expected expenditure levels. The Western TVD doctrine integrated industrial mobilization into this sustainment model, ensuring that wartime production could replenish consumed stocks beyond the initial 30-day threshold. Intelligence assessments by NATO during the 1970s and 1980s identified the 30-day sustainment assumption as a central element of Soviet planning, shaping Western estimates of how long Warsaw Pact forces could maintain offensive operations without strategic pause. Exercises conducted within the Warsaw Pact frequently rehearsed rapid rail mobilization, depot activation, and forward distribution to validate these assumptions, generating documented evidence of the scale and organization of rear services. The structure of the Western TVD logistics system reflected a deliberate attempt to align operational ambition with supply realism, embedding fuel pipelines, rail corridors, ammunition depots, and repair units into the architecture of offensive doctrine. Rather than improvising sustainment, during conflict, Soviet planners pre-calculated tonnage requirements, transportation cycles, and stockpile depth to ensure that front-level formations could execute their assigned missions during the opening month of war. This 30-day combat planning model therefore became a defining feature of Warsaw Pact war preparation in Europe, anchoring operational design in measurable logistical capacity and illustrating how Soviet strategy treated supply networks as decisive enablers of sustained offensive action in the Western theater of military operations. The doctrinal foundation for the 30-day sustainment model in the Western TVD was rooted in Soviet operational art, which treated logistics as inseparable from maneuver and firepower, particularly at the front level where multiple armies would conduct coordinated offensives across broad sectors of Central Europe. Soviet military theory emphasized deep operations, meaning that initial breakthroughs were to be exploited rapidly and continuously, preventing the adversary from stabilizing defensive lines, and this required that supply systems be organized to sustain high rates of advance without interruption. Planning documents from the 1960s through the 1980s indicate that front-level rear services were structured to support intense consumption rates during the opening phase of conflict, with ammunition expenditure projections calculated for artillery barrages, armored engagements, and air defense operations over successive days of combat. Fuel consumption planning was equally detailed, as tank and motor rifle divisions were expected to maneuver extensively, and their daily fuel requirements were incorporated into pre-war stockpile calculations. Pipelines extended westward from Soviet territory into Eastern Europe, linking refineries and storage facilities to forward depots capable of supplying advancing formations. Rail transport remained the backbone of strategic and operational movement, with dedicated military rail schedules pre-planned to surge fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment toward the Western TVD at the onset of mobilization. Railway troops were tasked not only with maintenance, but with rapid repair under fire, reflecting the assumption that NATO air interdiction would target transport corridors early in conflict. The 30-day model incorporated echelon depots arranged in depth, with forward dumps positioned close enough to sustain initial assaults, yet far enough from the front line to reduce vulnerability to direct attack. Larger operational reserves were maintained farther to the rear, ensuring that replenishment cycles could continue even if forward sites were disrupted. Soviet doctrine prescribed that front-level rear services maintain close coordination with operational headquarters, adjusting supply priorities according to daily maneuver objectives and anticipated expenditure patterns. Maintenance and repair units were integrated into this framework to prevent attrition from reducing combat strength, with mobile workshops accompanying advancing units and evacuation routes designated for heavily damaged equipment. NATO intelligence assessments in the 1970s and 1980s increasingly focused on identifying the scale of Warsaw Pact stockpiles and the density of rail and pipeline infrastructure supporting the Western TVD, interpreting depot expansion and rail traffic surges as indicators of readiness. Exercises conducted within the Warsaw Pact, including large-scale maneuvers in East Germany and Poland, demonstrated the capacity to mobilize and reposition rear services rapidly, reinforcing Western perceptions that the 30-day sustainment concept was not rhetorical, but operationally rehearsed. Industrial mobilization planning was integrated into the doctrine, with wartime production schedules designed to replenish ammunition and spare parts beyond the initial campaign period, thereby sustaining operations if conflict extended beyond 1 month. The emphasis on tempo shaped every aspect of logistics organization, as planners assumed that a pause in supply flow would undermine the momentum required to achieve operational objectives before NATO reinforcements could fully materialize. The Western TVD logistics doctrine therefore reflected a comprehensive attempt to synchronize stockpile depth, transportation capacity, and maintenance support with offensive maneuver expectations, embedding the 30-day sustainment assumption into the structural fabric of Soviet war planning in Europe. The practical implementation of the 30-day sustainment doctrine in the Western TVD required a dense network of fixed and mobile infrastructure stretching from the Western Soviet military districts into the forward-deployed Warsaw Pact territories, particularly the German Democratic Republic, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Soviet forces permanently stationed in East Germany, organized under the Group of Soviet Forces Germany, operated within a logistical environment specifically engineered to support rapid transition from peacetime posture to wartime offensive operations. Large ammunition depots were constructed in forested or semi-concealed areas, often dispersed into smaller storage clusters to reduce vulnerability to air attack, yet positioned within rail access distance to facilitate rapid loading and redistribution. Fuel storage facilities were similarly distributed, with above-ground tanks supplemented by underground storage in some sectors, and linked by pipeline extensions feeding toward projected axes of advance. The Soviet approach emphasized depth, meaning that supply networks were layered so that destruction of a forward dump would not halt operations because rear depots could continue to feed the front. Rail junctions in East Germany and Poland were upgraded to handle heavy military freight, and specialized loading ramps were built to accelerate the transfer of armored vehicles and bulk munitions onto flat cars. Planning documents identified specific corridors for forward thrusts, and logistics infrastructure was aligned accordingly, ensuring that anticipated operational routes were matched by corresponding supply arteries. Transportation battalions were assigned defined movement cycles, calculating turnaround times for rail convoys and tanker trucks to maintain continuous throughput. The 30-day sustainment assumption required precise tonnage forecasting, with front-level planners estimating daily expenditure for artillery ammunition, small arms rounds, anti-tank munitions, and air defense missiles based on modeled engagement intensity. Fuel forecasts accounted for continuous armored maneuver, recognizing that mechanized formations could consume vast quantities within a short period of high-tempo operations. Mobile repair brigades were structured to operate in echelon, with forward repair teams addressing immediate battlefield damage, while rear workshops handled more complex restoration, thereby reducing the loss of combat vehicles during the opening campaign. NATO intelligence analysts during the 1970s and 1980s documented the density of Soviet and Warsaw Pact depots in East Germany, noting the correlation between infrastructure expansion and doctrinal emphasis on sustained offensive capability. Aerial reconnaissance and satellite imagery identified storage bunkers, fuel tank farms, and rail marshalling yards linked to Soviet rear services, reinforcing Western assessments that the 30-day model was supported by substantial material preparation. Exercises within the Warsaw Pact frequently included large-scale rear services drills, testing convoy routing, fuel distribution, and rapid depot activation under simulated combat conditions. The integration of Allied Warsaw Pact states into this logistics network was formalized through coordinated stockpile planning, ensuring that Polish and Czechoslovak rail systems could support surge traffic toward the German border. The Western TVD logistics doctrine therefore manifested not only in theoretical manuals, but in a physically constructed and rehearsed network designed to sustain intense combat for at least 1 month. This integration of fixed depots, pipelines, rail corridors, transportation units, and repair formations illustrates how the Soviet military embedded sustainment depth directly into its operational architecture, aligning infrastructure investment with doctrinal expectations for rapid and sustained offensive warfare in Central Europe. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the 30-day sustainment concept in the Western TVD was supported not only by infrastructure in East Germany and Poland, but by deep logistical preparation within the Western military districts of the Soviet Union itself, ensuring that operational level supply in the forward theater could be reinforced continuously from interior strategic reserves. Large ammunition production facilities in the Soviet interior were linked to rail networks designated for rapid wartime surge, and mobilization schedules outlined how factory output would transition from peacetime quotas to intensified wartime production. Strategic stockpiles were accumulated in depth, with layered reserves positioned in successive belts from Soviet territory westward toward the forward depots in Warsaw Pact states. This echelon system ensured that even if forward dumps were degraded by air attack or interdiction, replenishment could flow from rear layers through pre-planned corridors. Soviet railway doctrine incorporated detailed wartime timetables, allocating specific train paths for fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement equipment, and assigning military traffic priority over civilian freight. Railway troops were trained to restore damaged track sections rapidly, erect temporary bridges, and maintain throughput under conditions of attack, reflecting a doctrinal expectation that NATO air forces would target transportation arteries early. Fuel logistics were structured around both pipeline and tanker delivery systems, with major pipelines extending into Eastern Europe and branch lines feeding forward operational areas. Calculations of daily fuel requirement for tank and motor rifle divisions were embedded into planning models, ensuring that front-level commanders could rely on predictable replenishment during the opening campaign phase. The Soviet concept of material technical support treated maintenance as integral to sustainment, organizing repair brigades in layers so that lightly damaged vehicles could be restored near the front, while severely damaged equipment was evacuated to rear workshops. NATO intelligence reporting during this period frequently highlighted the density of Soviet rail traffic exercises and depot construction activity as indicators of readiness consistent with the 30-day model. Western analysts observed that Warsaw Pact maneuvers often included substantial rear services, components demonstrating convoy discipline, fuel distribution drills, and rapid depot activation. Operational planning documents captured by Western intelligence indicated that the initial 30-day period was designed to achieve decisive operational objectives before NATO reinforcement could fully stabilize the front, reinforcing the urgency embedded in Soviet tempo assumptions. Industrial mobilization planning extended beyond ammunition production to include spare parts, vehicle replacement, and engineering equipment necessary to maintain operational momentum. The logistical system was therefore conceived as a continuous pipeline stretching from factory output in the Soviet interior to frontline units advancing in Central Europe. This integration of strategic industry, rail mobilization, forward depots, and mobile repair units illustrates how the Western TVD sustainment doctrine was anchored in quantifiable capacity rather than aspirational theory. The 30-day combat model did not represent a limitation of ambition, but a defined initial campaign window within which operational objectives were expected to be secured through sustained, uninterrupted supply. By aligning industrial depth with forward distribution networks, Soviet planners embedded logistical endurance into the structural framework of their European war plans, ensuring that the opening phase of conflict would be supported by pre-calculated reserves and rehearsed transportation cycles capable of sustaining high-intensity combat across multiple fronts. The 30-day sustainment framework also shaped the organizational structure of front-level rear services within the Western TVD, where logistics headquarters operated alongside operational command elements to synchronize supply flow with maneuver objectives on a daily basis. Soviet doctrine required that front commanders receive continuous reporting on ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, vehicle readiness rates, and transportation availability, allowing operational plans to adjust in accordance with logistical realities rather than abstract projections. Rear Services Directorates maintained detailed forecasts of daily tonnage requirements, calculating how many rail cars, tanker trucks, and pipeline volumes were necessary to sustain artillery barrages, armored thrusts, and air defense operations. This system depended on precise accounting and disciplined reporting procedures that tracked stock levels at each echelon of supply, from forward dumps near the line of contact to deeper depots positioned farther east. Transportation brigades were assigned rotational cycles designed to maintain uninterrupted movement along designated corridors, with convoy spacing, rest intervals, and refueling schedules standardized to preserve tempo under continuous operations. The Western TVD plan assumed that attrition would be significant during the opening phase, and therefore incorporated structured replacement flows for both equipment and personnel, ensuring that depleted units could be restored without halting offensive momentum. Repair and evacuation doctrine emphasized rapid recovery of damaged vehicles to prevent irreversible losses, integrating specialized recovery vehicles and mobile workshops into maneuver formations. NATO intelligence assessments frequently focused on identifying the density and distribution of these rear services units, interpreting their scale as an indicator of how long sustained operations could continue. Reconnaissance imagery and intercepted communications suggested that logistical headquarters exercised detailed control over resource allocation, redirecting supply convoys in response to simulated battlefield developments during Warsaw Pact exercises. Industrial coordination extended into spare parts, manufacturing, and vehicle refurbishment cycles, ensuring that maintenance capacity could support sustained usage rates beyond peacetime norms. The emphasis on 30 days of combat was therefore embedded not only in stockpile depth, but in the procedural architecture governing how supplies were requested, dispatched, and replenished. Soviet military journals and doctrinal publications underscored that tempo could not be maintained without uninterrupted logistics flow, reinforcing the principle that supply continuity was inseparable from operational success. As NATO reinforcement capabilities improved during the 1980s, Soviet planners maintained the 30-day sustainment assumption as a benchmark against which their readiness was measured, refining depot dispersal and transportation redundancy to mitigate vulnerability. This sustained focus on quantifiable logistics capacity demonstrates that the Western TVD doctrine was constructed around a realistic appraisal of consumption rates and transportation limits. By institutionalizing daily reporting, layered stockpiles, mobile repair integration, and structured convoy cycles, the Soviet military created a logistical framework designed to sustain intense combat for a defined campaign period. The 30-day model thus functioned as both a planning horizon and a measurable standard of preparedness, embedding endurance calculations directly into the operational design of a potential European conflict. As the Cold War entered its final decade, the 30-day sustainment model in the Western TVD remained a central benchmark within Soviet planning, but it was increasingly analyzed in relation to NATO's evolving reinforcement posture and improvements in precision strike capability. Soviet assessments acknowledged that the ability to maintain uninterrupted supply flow for a full month would depend not only on stockpile depth, but on the survivability of transportation corridors under sustained interdiction. Consequently, planners emphasized redundancy across rail networks, alternate routing options, and rapid repair capacity to mitigate the impact of air and missile strikes. Additional emphasis was placed on dispersal of ammunition and fuel depots, reducing the risk that concentrated storage sites could be neutralized in early phases of conflict. Pipeline extensions were hardened and in some sectors buried to reduce vulnerability, while tanker truck fleets were expanded to supplement fixed distribution lines if pipelines were disrupted. Railway troops continued to rehearse emergency restoration drills, including track replacement, bridge repair, and rerouting under simulated attack conditions. NATO intelligence reporting during the late 1980s noted ongoing Warsaw Pact logistics exercises consistent with sustained high-intensity planning, suggesting that the 30-day campaign assumption remained embedded in doctrine. The coordination between strategic industry and forward depots was also refined, with contingency schedules outlining how interior factories would surge output to replenish expended munitions during the initial campaign. Front-level rear services maintained updated consumption forecasts, recalibrating daily requirements to reflect changes in equipment density and anticipated engagement intensity. The 30-day planning horizon continued to influence the allocation of transportation assets, ensuring that rail capacity, tanker fleets, and repair units were scaled to meet projected tonnage flows. Even as political developments accelerated in Eastern Europe, the logistical framework supporting the Western TVD remained intact, reflecting its deep institutionalization within Soviet military structure. The physical network of depots, rail lines, pipelines, and repair formations represented decades of preparation aligned with a defined sustainment objective. NATO analysts continued to treat this model as a key factor in estimating Warsaw Pact operational endurance, integrating stockpile assessments into broader balance of power calculations. The 30-day sustainment doctrine thus functioned as a measurable expression of Soviet strategic intent, anchoring offensive planning in quantifiable logistics capacity. It demonstrated an effort to align operational ambition with industrial production, transportation throughput, and maintenance resilience. By constructing layered reserves, reinforcing rail infrastructure, dispersing depots, and institutionalizing mobile repair, the Soviet military embedded endurance into the structural core of its European war plans. The Western TVD logistics doctrine therefore stands as a documented example of how Cold War strategy translated into infrastructure investment and rehearsed supply procedures, shaping assumptions about the duration and intensity of potential conflict in Central Europe. In the final assessment, the Soviet Western TVD logistics doctrine, built around 30 days of sustained combat, represents one of the most structured and quantifiable sustainment models of the Cold War, reflecting a deliberate effort to synchronize operational ambition with material capacity. From the western military districts of the Soviet Union through Poland and East Germany, an integrated network of rail corridors, pipeline systems, dispersed ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, transportation brigades, and repair formations was constructed and rehearsed to support an intensive initial campaign phase. The 30-day benchmark was not an arbitrary figure, but a planning horizon derived from consumption projections, transportation throughput calculations, and industrial mobilization schedules designed to sustain high-tempo offensive operations before requiring strategic pause or large-scale replenishment. Front-level rear services were organized to maintain continuous reporting on stock levels, fuel flow, ammunition expenditure, and vehicle readiness, embedding logistics oversight directly into operational command structures. Railway troops, pipeline engineers, tanker fleets, and mobile repair brigades were integrated into maneuver planning, ensuring that sustainment was treated as an active enabler rather than a background function. NATO intelligence assessments throughout the 1970s and 1980s consistently interpreted the density of Warsaw Pact depots, the scale of rail exercises, and the expansion of pipeline infrastructure as evidence of this sustained combat planning model. The layered arrangement of stockpiles in depth, combined with dispersal and redundancy measures, was designed to preserve supply continuity even under conditions of air interdiction. Industrial coordination within the Soviet interior supported this framework by aligning production surges with projected battlefield expenditure during the opening campaign. The Western TVD sustainment doctrine therefore embodied a comprehensive integration of infrastructure, transportation, maintenance, and stockpile management, anchoring offensive war planning in measurable logistical endurance. By defining a 30-day window for sustained high-intensity operations, Soviet planners imposed a structured temporal framework on their campaign design, ensuring that tempo calculations were supported by documented supply capacity. This model illustrates how Cold War strategy in Europe was shaped not solely by force numbers or nuclear posture, but by the practical realities of moving, fueling, repairing, and rearming large mechanized formations across extended distances. The physical network constructed to support this doctrine, from rail marshalling yards to forward ammunition bunkers, reflected decades of investment aligned with a specific sustainment objective. In this way, the Western TVD logistics system demonstrates how the outcome of any potential European conflict would have depended on the durability and resilience of supply networks operating under intense pressure. The 30-day sustainment assumption thus stands as a documented foundation of Warsaw Pact war planning, embedding endurance calculations into the structural core of Cold War military preparation and illustrating how logistics capacity defined the operational limits of strategy in Central Europe.